Picture this. You're one of Hollywood's most handsome leading men, adored by millions, your face on every magazine cover, but you're losing your hair. What do? In the 1960s and 70s, the answer seemed obvious. Get a hair transplant. But what if I told you that decision turned some of America's most beloved stars into walking hair disasters? We're talking about the pioneers of cosmetic procedures who became unwitting guinea pigs for experimental techniques. So primitive, they looked like someone had planted cornrows on their scalps. These aren't just bad hair days. These are career-defining catastrophes that haunted Hollywood legends for decades. Before we dive into these jaw-dropping transformations, hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We're giving away a classic Hollywood DVD collection to one lucky viewer. Now let's expose Hollywood's most embarrassing hair secrets that studios spent millions trying to hide. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the Bad Hair Board. Frank Sinatra became one of the first major celebrities to undergo hair transplant surgery in the 1960s, but his bravery didn't guarantee beautiful results. The primitive plug technique involved removing small circular sections from the back of his head and literally plugging them into his balding crown. The outcome was catastrophic. Sinatra looked like someone had planted perfect circles of hair across his scalp in geometric rows. The texture mismatch between natural and transplanted hair created a patchwork effect that no amount of pomade could disguise. The most embarrassing moment came during a 1965 TV special when studio lights made him sweat, causing his carefully styled hair to separate and reveal the obvious plug pattern underneath. Photographers had to use special lighting and creative angles to hide the doll-like appearance that became Hollywood's whispered cautionary tale. Burt Reynolds, the bandit's rug revelation. Burt Reynolds' early 1970s hair transplant became one of Hollywood's most notorious surgical disasters, transforming the masculine charmer into a walking advertisement for what not to do. The procedure left Reynolds with an unnaturally straight, low hairline that looked painted on rather than grown naturally. Hair grew in bizarre patterns with inconsistent density. Thick patches next to sparse areas, creating a wig-like appearance that fooled absolutely no one. Reynolds later admitted the transplant was his biggest mistake, confessing he should have embraced natural baldness instead. Tragically, he spent decades trying to fix the original disaster with additional surgeries, but each attempt made things progressively worse. The constant interventions left permanent scarring and damaged follicles. The greatest irony was that Reynolds' natural masculinity and magnetic personality would have made him incredibly attractive bald. His artificial hairline only distracted from his genuine appeal and confident charisma. Sammy Davis Jr., the Rat Pack's hair disaster. Sammy Davis Jr.'s natural baldness perfectly suited his dynamic personality and electrifying stage presence. But his late 1960s hair transplant created an unnatural hairline that transformed the multi-talented entertainer into a cautionary example. The procedure left Davis with what resembled a toupee made from his own hair, a dense, unnatural patch at his hairline that contrasted sharply with naturally thinning sides and back. He attempted disguising the obvious transplant with elaborate pompadours and heavy styling products. But stage lights made the artificial plugs cast shadows that created an even more unnatural appearance. The harsh nightclub lighting essential for his performances became his enemy, highlighting every artificial follicle. Constant use of styling products to hide the transplant damaged his remaining natural hair, creating a vicious cycle requiring more artificial enhancement. By the 1970s, he needed transplanted hair, extensions, and strategic combing just to maintain the illusion of natural hair. William Shatner, the captain's cosmic hair. Catastrophe. Captain Kirk could boldly explore unknown galaxies, but William Shatner's hair transplant journey was one voyage he should have completely avoided. Beginning in the late 1960s during his Star Trek years, Shatner's multiple procedures using primitive plug techniques left him with obvious rows of transplanted hair that became decades-long comedy material. The transplant created an unnaturally thick hairline that defied aging laws. While his face showed normal signs of getting older, his hairline remained exactly the same for decades, creating a bizarre disconnect that made the artificial nature obvious to everyone. The plugs were placed too close together, creating density resembling a scrub brush rather than human hair. What made Shatner's situation particularly noticeable was his hair seeming frozen in time. The spacing was so obviously artificial, it became a running joke among fans and critics. The transplant left permanent scarring, making complete head shaving impossible and trapping him with his artificial hairline for life. Tony Curtis, some like it, transplanted. Tony Curtis underwent one of Hollywood's most extensive hair transplant marathons, starting in the 1960s and continuing for decades with increasingly disappointing results. The outdated techniques left him with an unnatural cornrow pattern across his scalp that makeup artists struggled desperately to disguise during filming. The transplanted hair grew in straight geometric lines rather than natural patterns, creating an agricultural appearance resembling crop planting more than human hair growth. As Curtis aged, transplanted hair remained thick and dark, while natural hair turned gray, creating a two-toned effect, making the artificial nature even more glaringly obvious. Curtis became obsessed with his hair, undergoing additional procedures every few years, each attempting to fix problems created by previous surgeries. The constant surgical interventions left his scalp scarred and damaged, making subsequent procedures more difficult and less successful. He eventually had to dye all hair to match transplanted sections, creating unnaturally uniform coloring that also looked completely artificial. Mel Gibson, The Road Warrior's Hair, Highway. Mel Gibson's hair transplant represents the continuation of techniques that plagued earlier Hollywood stars with disastrous results. His procedure left him with an unnatural hairline that was too straight and dense for his age, creating what hair experts call a forest fire pattern, areas of very dense hair directly next to completely bald patches. This uneven distribution made natural hairstyling impossible, forcing Gibson to rely on careful camera angles and strategic lighting to hide obvious plugs during filming. Ironically, his natural receding hairline had given him a distinguished, mature appearance that suited his later career roles far better than the artificial, youthful hairline. The procedure made him look younger in an unnatural way that didn't match his facial aging progression. Directors had to exercise extreme caution about lighting and camera angles to avoid showing the plug pattern, which limited how Gibson could be filmed and sometimes negatively affected his performance opportunities, making the transplant a creative constraint rather than confidence booster. John Travolta, The Disco Hair Disaster. John Travolta's thick, flowing hair in Saturday Night Fever and Grease made him a heartthrob for millions worldwide. But when he started losing that iconic hair in the 1980s, his early transplant procedures left him with an unnatural hairline resembling marker drawings. Travolta's transplant created a hairline that was too perfect and symmetrical to look remotely natural. Real hairlines have subtle irregularities and variations, but his surgical hairline looked like it had been created with engineering precision and mathematical calculations. The transplanted hair also had completely different texture and growth patterns than his natural hair, creating an obvious demarcation line that was impossible to hide. What made Travolta's situation particularly difficult was his career renaissance in the 1990s, bringing renewed attention to his appearance. High-definition cameras and improved lighting technology made his hair transplant even more obvious, leading to constant media speculation and public ridicule. The casual, tousled looks that characterized his early image became completely impossible to achieve naturally. Elton John. The Rocket Man's hair didn't take flight. While Elton John eventually embraced his baldness and became famous for elaborate wigs and hairpieces as fashion statements, his early 1970s hair transplant attempts were absolutely disastrous. The primitive punch graft technique left him with sparse, uneven patches of transplanted hair that looked significantly worse than his natural baldness would have appeared. The procedures removed small circular sections of scalp and transplanted them in obvious geometric patterns across his head. The result looked exactly like what it was: small plugs of hair inserted into his scalp like a connect-the-dots puzzle game. The transplanted hair grew in different directions with inconsistent density, making any natural styling completely impossible to achieve. John eventually abandoned the failed transplants and turned to the elaborate wigs and toupees that became part of his signature flamboyant look. The failed transplants actually led to one of entertainment's most successful reinventions, as embracing artificial hair as fashion rather than hiding baldness turned hair loss into creative opportunity. Sean Connery. Bond's hair didn't have a license to kill. Sean Connery's early 1970s hair transplant attempts were so spectacularly unsuccessful that he eventually gave up completely and embraced his baldness, becoming one of Hollywood's most famous and attractive bald actors. The primitive plug technique left him with patchy, unnatural-looking hair that didn't suit his rugged, sophisticated image at all. The transplants created obvious circular patterns across his scalp, with transplanted hair having different color and texture than his remaining natural hair. This patchwork effect was particularly noticeable in close-up shots, making the artificial nature impossible to hide from cameras. The most ironic aspect of Connery's hair disaster was that his natural baldness actually enhanced his masculine, sophisticated image dramatically. When he finally shaved his head completely, he became even more attractive and distinguished-looking than before. Connery's decision to embrace baldness was revolutionary for Hollywood, proving that hair loss could be incredibly sexy and sophisticated, paving the way for other actors to feel comfortable with their natural appearance and aging process. Marlon Brando. The Godfather's hair. Offer you can refuse. Marlon Brando's hair transplant disaster was Hollywood's best-kept secret for decades, hidden from public view through elaborate cover-ups. The legendary actor underwent multiple failed procedures in the 1970s that were so catastrophically bad, he had to wear wigs and hairpieces for most of his later career appearances. Brando's transplants created an unnatural hairline that was too low and straight for his distinctive face shape. The procedure left permanent scarring that made complete baldness impossible, trapping him in a cycle of increasingly elaborate cover-ups and artificial solutions. The transplanted hair grew in random directions with inconsistent density, creating what one makeup artist memorably described as grass growing through concrete. Brando was so embarrassed by the disastrous results that he refused to be photographed without a hat or hairpiece for the rest of his life. What made his situation particularly tragic was that natural baldness would have been perfect for many of his later iconic roles. But instead of embracing age and natural appearance, he was trapped by artificial constraints. These disasters weren't the result of vanity alone. They were victims of primitive 1960s and 70s technology. The standard punch graft technique removed circular sections of scalp and transplanted them to balding areas, creating several devastating problems that haunted these stars for life. The plugs were too large and contained too many follicles, creating an unnatural doll hair appearance. The circular shape was completely unnatural. Real hair doesn't grow in perfect circles. The technique ignored natural hair growth direction and angle, so transplanted hair often grew randomly. What's often overlooked is the psychological impact these disasters had on these stars. Many became obsessed with their appearance, undergoing multiple procedures, trying to fix problems created by the original transplant. The failed transplants often made them more self-conscious than natural baldness ever had. These Hollywood pioneers paid the price for being early adopters, but their experiences helped develop the safer, more effective techniques available today. Their disasters remind us that sometimes natural aging is more attractive than artificial attempts to fight it. What's your take on these hair disasters? Should these stars have embraced their natural baldness instead? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more Hollywood secrets that studios tried to hide.